You know that feeling when you're scrolling through your phone at midnight, and suddenly you stumble upon something that makes you think, wait, they've been keeping this secret the whole time? That's exactly what we're diving into today. Because behind every perfectly coordinated choreography, every synchronized comeback, and every infectious S-class moment, there's a set of unwritten rules that JYP Entertainment planted deep into Stray Kids' DNA when nobody was watching. We're talking about the foundational principles that literally shaped how these 8 members interact with each other, how they present themselves to the world, and ultimately, what makes their brotherhood so genuine that you can feel it through your screen. But here's the million-one question. How much of what we see is actually the real them, and how much is the carefully constructed framework that Bangchan, Lino, Changbin, Hyunjin, Han, Felix, Sungmin, and I.N agreed to live by from day one? Throughout this deep dive, you're going to discover the specific relationship philosophies that turned 8 teenagers into a unified force, the unspoken contracts that keep them from falling apart when everything gets tough, and the behind-the-scenes moments that shaped their entire dynamic. We'll break down exactly what JYP whispered behind those closed doors, why certain members have specific roles within the group, what happens when those rules get tested, and most importantly, why Stays have been defending Stray Kids' authenticity with such fierce loyalty despite knowing absolutely nothing about their private arrangements. This isn't just about K-pop industry standards or typical company protocols. This is about a very particular philosophy that transformed 8 ordinary guys into one of the most cohesive, trusted, and emotionally intelligent groups in the industry. So buckle up, because what you're about to hear will make you see Stray Kids in a completely different light, and you'll never look at their interactions the same way again. Are you ready to go deep into the Stray Kids vault? Number 8. The leader first, friend second, mandate. Why Bangchan bears an invisible crown. When Bangchan was brought into JYP Entertainment as a trainee back in 2010 at just 13 years old, he wasn't just being groomed to be a talented idol. He was being systematically prepared to carry the weight of leadership on his shoulders for the rest of his career. This is where the first major relationship rule comes into play, and it's something that fundamentally changes how you understand Bangchan's entire existence within Stray Kids. The leader first, friend second philosophy means that Bangchan had to internalize a specific hierarchy of priorities that directly impacts every single decision he makes, from who gets to speak in interviews to how conflicts are resolved behind closed doors to who carries the emotional burden when things go sideways. JYP didn't just appoint Bangchan as the leader and hand him a microphone. They essentially told him that his personal comfort, his friendships at the same level as other members, and his own emotional needs would always come second to the stability and cohesion of the entire group. This isn't a casual responsibility. This is a structural framework that demands Chan to be simultaneously a brother, a father figure, a mediator, a decision-maker, and a shield for the other 7 members all at the same time. Think about it. Every single time Stray Kids goes through a scandal, every time a member struggles, every time the group faces criticism, Bangchan is the one who has to absorb it first, process it privately, and then figure out how to present the group's unified response. He's literally trained to put the group's image, the group's mental health, and the group's trajectory above his own, and that's not something you can just switch off when the cameras stop rolling. The reality is that this rule creates an invisible distance between Bangchan and the other members, not in a negative way necessarily, but in a very real, very deliberate way that prevents him from ever being truly just friends with them. When he's hanging out with them, part of his brain is always working, always calculating, always making sure everything is balanced and nobody feels left out or undervalued. This is why you see Bangchan constantly checking in on members during live streams, why he's always the first to defend someone who's being criticized, and why he rarely, if ever, puts himself in a position where his own needs might overshadow someone else's moment. JYP essentially told him, "You will be the foundation that everyone else stands on," and Bangchan, with all his resilience and emotional intelligence, accepted that role completely and has been living by it for over a decade. What makes this particularly heartbreaking is that Bang Chan seems completely aware of this dynamic. He's talked in interviews about the loneliness of leadership, about how it's different being the leader, and about how he sometimes feels the weight of carrying the group. But he never complains about it. He never resents it. He just keeps moving forward, because that's what the rule demands, and that's what he promised himself he would do when he decided to dedicate his life to Stray Kids. Number 7. The Transparency Over Secrets Protocol. Why Stray Kids Can Never Hide from Each Other. Here's something that might shock you. JYP Entertainment, despite being a massive corporation that operates on image management and calculated narratives, actually implemented a rule within Stray Kids that directly contradicts the typical K-pop industry norm of keeping things under wraps. The Transparency Over Secrets Protocol is basically JYP's way of saying that within the confines of the dorm, within the practice rooms, and within the group's private spaces, there should be almost zero tolerance for hidden agendas, secret relationships, undisclosed issues, or information that one member knows but others don't. This is radical in the K-pop industry because most groups operate on a need-to-know basis, where the company tells certain members certain things, and those members are expected to keep their mouths shut and not create unnecessary drama by sharing information. But JYP's philosophy with Stray Kids was different. They believed that if the members were completely transparent with each other about everything from personal struggles to romantic interests to career anxieties to physical health issues, then the group would develop an unbreakable bond built on trust rather than on forced camaraderie. Think about what this actually means in practical terms. If one member is dealing with depression, they can't just hide it and pretend everything's fine. They have to tell the group. If another member is interested in someone romantically, they're expected to be honest about it with their members. If someone's physical health is declining, if someone's struggling with their parents, if someone's feeling suicidal thoughts, these aren't things that get buried under layers of professional confidentiality. They get shared, discussed, and addressed as a collective unit. This creates an entirely different psychological environment than what you typically see in K-pop groups, where members often feel isolated in their struggles because they can't talk to their closest companions about what's really going on in their lives. The brilliance of this rule, from JYP's perspective, is that it turns the other members into a built-in support system rather than just people you live with and work with. When Han was struggling mentally during certain comeback periods, the group knew about it because the transparency rule demanded it. When Hyunjin was dealing with his scandal in 2021, the members weren't blindsided. They already knew his side of the story because they had maintained this culture of complete honesty. When Felix was homesick in his early years, he didn't have to suffer alone wondering if his members would judge him for being emotionally vulnerable. He knew he could share it because the rule created a safe space for that kind of honesty. But here's where it gets complicated and slightly invasive. This protocol also means that privacy, in the traditional sense, becomes almost obsolete within the group dynamic. There's a thin line between healthy transparency and unhealthy surveillance, and Stray Kids members have had to navigate that line constantly. They can't really keep anything to themselves without it feeling like a betrayal of the group's foundational principle. If a member is going through something and doesn't immediately share it, the other members might feel hurt or excluded, which creates this subtle social pressure to always be open, always be vulnerable, and never keep anything back. It's like living in a glass house where everyone can see everything, and while that builds incredible trust and intimacy, it also removes the possibility of having your own private mental space within the group. This is why you see Stray Kids members being so emotionally available and open in their content. It's not just personality, it's literally a structural requirement embedded into how they were trained to relate to each other. They've internalized the idea that keeping secrets from each other is a form of betrayal, so they naturally gravitate towards sharing more than most idol groups would ever consider appropriate. The members have spoken in various interviews about how close they are, how they know everything about each other, and how they can't imagine not being completely honest with one another. And that's not just them being nice or promotional. That's them describing the actual operating system of their relationship, the one that JYP installed and that they've all agreed to maintain. Number 5. The individual authenticity versus group image balance. Why members can't just be themselves, even when they're being themselves. This is arguably one of the most psychologically complex rules that JYP embedded into Stray Kids' relationship framework, and it's something that creates constant internal tension for every single member without them probably even fully realizing it. The individual authenticity versus group image balance is essentially JYP's attempt to solve an impossible problem. How do you allow members to be genuine, relatable, and human while simultaneously protecting the group's carefully constructed brand and commercial viability? The answer, it turns out, is incredibly nuanced and requires members to perform a version of authenticity that's been pre-approved and strategically filtered, which creates this bizarre psychological space where members are simultaneously being completely honest and completely calculated at the same time. Let's talk about what this actually means in practical terms, because this is where the rule becomes almost suffocating in its complexity. When Stray Kids puts out content, whether it's a behind-the-scenes vlog, a live stream, a variety show appearance, or an interview, the members are operating within a framework where they're encouraged to show their real personalities, to share genuine moments, and to create an authentic connection with stays. But this authenticity isn't actually unfiltered. It's been carefully pre-screened and approved by JYP's content team and marketing department to ensure that nothing they say or do contradicts the group's established image or risks damaging their commercial prospects. So when Han is being funny and chaotic on a live stream, he's being genuinely funny and genuinely chaotic, but he's also very aware of exactly how far he can push it before it becomes problematic. When Felix is being sweet and encouraging to other members, he's being genuinely sweet and genuinely encouraging, but he's also calibrating how much emotional vulnerability he shows because there's an invisible line between endearing and concerning that the company has drawn. This creates a constant state of semi-conscious self-monitoring where members are hyper-aware of their own performance even when they're supposed to be relaxed and natural. The brilliance of this rule, from a company perspective, is that it allows JYP to maintain plausible deniability about controlling the members' image while simultaneously maintaining complete control over how they're perceived. If someone criticizes Stray Kids for being fake or overly manufactured, the company can point to all the authentic content they produce and say, "Look, these are genuine moments that prove they're real." But if a member ever says or does something that actually threatens the group's image, the company can immediately implement damage control and claim that the member was taken out of context or misunderstood, rather than admitting that they've been deliberately shaping the member's presentation all along. This rule also creates fascinating power dynamics between the members themselves, because they all know on some level that they're performing authenticity. But they can't really talk about it directly without acknowledging the artificiality of their entire existence together. So instead, they maintain this collective agreement to treat their authentic selves as genuine, even while being aware that there are boundaries and limitations to that authenticity. It's like they're all actors in a play who have agreed never to step out of character, not even backstage, because stepping out of character would shatter the illusion that they're all maintaining for each other and for the world. Think about how this impacts their actual friendships and relationships with each other. Can Bang-chan truly be vulnerable with the other members without worrying about how that vulnerability might affect his leadership position or the group's image if it somehow got out? Can Felix genuinely express frustration or anger without feeling like he needs to immediately counterbalance it with positivity and gratitude to maintain his sunshine brand? Can Hyunjin be completely authentic in his interactions with the group when his entire position within the group and within the industry is contingent on carefully managing his image and his reputation? The answer to all of these questions is probably no, not entirely. There are always invisible guardrails, always unspoken boundaries, always this subtle awareness that, even in private moments with their brothers, they're still somewhat on stage. This creates a strange kind of intimacy where members are incredibly close to each other while simultaneously being somewhat distant, where they know everything about each other while also maintaining carefully curated versions of themselves for public consumption. What's particularly interesting is that this rule seems to have actually worked in Stray Kids' favor, because the group has managed to maintain a relatively clean image while also appearing incredibly genuine and relatable compared to many other K-pop groups. Members can share vulnerable moments about their struggles, Han talking about his mental health issues, Hyunjin dealing with controversy, members discussing homesickness and pressure in a way that feels authentic because it is authentic. But it's also been strategically positioned to maintain the group's image as a group of vulnerable but resilient young men who are constantly working to improve themselves. The authenticity is real. It's just been filtered through a very specific lens of what kinds of authenticity are permissible and what kinds of authenticity might damage the brand. This rule also creates a fascinating hierarchy of acceptable authenticity, where different members are allowed to be authentic in different ways. Felix can be authentically vulnerable and emotional because his brand is built on being the emotional support member. Han can be authentically chaotic and impulsive because his brand is built on him being creative and unpredictable. Changbin can be authentically intense and serious because his brand is built on him being focused and dedicated. But if Felix suddenly started being aggressive and competitive, if Han became emotionally withdrawn, or if Changbin became frivolous and silly, it would feel inauthentic not because they're not being genuine, but because they would be deviating from the carefully established framework of what their authenticity is allowed to look like. JYP has essentially pre-defined the parameters of each member's allowed authenticity, and while this creates a sense of stability and predictability for the group, it also constrains how much genuine evolution and change the members can experience without being perceived as changing in a way that damages their brand. The members have probably internalized this so deeply at this point that they might not even realize they're doing it anymore. Their authentic self might actually be the filtered version at this point, because they've been living within these boundaries for so long that the boundaries have become invisible and indistinguishable from their actual personality. But there are moments, glimpses in behind-the-scenes content, rare candid interviews, or subtle social media posts, where you can catch them being slightly more unfiltered than usual, and in those moments, you realize how much psychological labor goes into maintaining this perfect balance between being genuinely themselves and being strategically themselves. Number 6. The hierarchy within equality framework. Why some members have more say than others, and it's not about talent. This is where things get genuinely fascinating and slightly uncomfortable, because JYP Entertainment created a rule structure that sounds paradoxical on the surface, but makes perfect sense once you understand the Korean cultural context and the specific dynamics of Stray Kids. The hierarchy within equality framework is essentially JYP's way of saying that while all 8 members are equally valued and equally important to the group's success, there are predetermined levels of decision-making authority, speaking privileges, and influence that vary based on factors that have absolutely nothing to do with vocal ability, dancing skill, or visual appeal. This is where seniority, age, trainee duration, and specific skill sets create invisible ranks within the group that members are expected to respect and operate within, even though these ranks are never explicitly stated or formally announced. Let's break down what this actually looks like in practice. Bang Chan, as the leader and the oldest, obviously sits at the top of this hierarchy. But then you have Lino, who despite being younger than several other members, holds significant authority because he's the second longest trainee and has earned respect through his work ethic and reliability. Then you move down to members like Changbin and Hyunjin, who occupy middle-tier positions for different reasons. Changbin through his production skills and creative input, Hyunjin through his seniority and visual prominence. And then you have the younger members like Han, Felix, Sungmin, and I.N, who are positioned at different levels based on their specific contributions and their tenure within the group. The reason this matters so much is because it directly impacts everything from who gets to suggest choreography changes, to who gets the final say in interpreting a lyric, to whose opinion matters most when the group is making decisions about their image or their direction. It's not that the younger members can't speak up or contribute ideas, they absolutely can and do, but there's an understood framework where their suggestions are presented more tentatively, where they're expected to defer to the opinions of senior members, and where they're positioned as learners and followers rather than leaders and decision-makers. This is deeply rooted in Korean hierarchical culture, where age and tenure are sacred, and where respecting the natural order of the group is seen as essential to maintaining harmony. JYP took this cultural norm and weaponized it strategically within Stray Kids by making it an explicit rule rather than just an implicit understanding. What's particularly clever about this approach is that it prevents the kind of chaos that can emerge when you have 8 equally talented individuals all vying for influence and recognition. By establishing clear hierarchies, JYP essentially solved the problem of internal power struggles before they could even emerge. Each member knows their position, knows what level of authority they're expected to exercise, and knows which decisions are theirs to make, and which ones belong to people higher up the chain. Han can't just decide to completely overhaul a song arrangement because, while his production ideas are valued and respected, he doesn't hold the authority to make those kinds of group-level decisions on his own. Felix can't unilaterally decide that he wants a more prominent position in a music video because his position in the hierarchy doesn't grant him that kind of decision-making power. But the incredibly important part is that this hierarchy isn't rigid or unchanging. It's fluid and based on context. When it comes to vocal arrangements, Sungmin and I.N have more authority because they're the main vocalists. When it comes to choreography suggestions, Lee No's opinion carries more weight because he's the choreographer. When it comes to creative direction and production, Changbin and Han have elevated positions because of their skills in those areas. So it's not like the younger members are permanently subordinated. Instead, their authority fluctuates based on the specific domain being discussed. This creates a sophisticated system where everyone has areas where they lead and areas where they follow, and the group operates in a constant state of calibrated respect and responsibility sharing. The psychological impact of this framework on the members is actually quite profound. On one hand, it reduces anxiety because everyone knows exactly where they stand and what's expected of them. There's no ambiguity about who should be making what decision, so there's less room for resentment or feelings of being overlooked. On the other hand, it can create a sense of limitation for younger members who might feel constrained by the system, who might have ideas that never get heard because they're positioned lower in the hierarchy, or who might feel like they're not being trusted with more responsibility. What's interesting is that you can actually see this framework playing out in real time during Stray Kids content and interviews. When they're doing a group discussion, you'll notice that Bang Chan often speaks first and longest, setting the tone for the conversation. Lee No will add his perspective in a way that's authoritative but not contradicting. Then you move down through the members in a fairly predictable pattern where speaking time and speaking authority gradually decrease as you get to the younger members. The younger members don't seem resentful about this. They seem completely normalized to it, which suggests that this hierarchy has been so thoroughly integrated into their operating system that it feels natural and right to them. It's not that they're being silenced, it's that they've been trained since they were trainees to understand their position within the group and to express themselves in ways that respect that position. This framework also serves a protective function for the company. By establishing clear hierarchies, JYP can control the group's direction and messaging more effectively because the authority ultimately flows upward through Bang Chan to the company itself. If all 8 members had equal say in everything, the company would face constant negotiations and disagreements that could dilute their message or damage their brand. By implementing this hierarchy, they've created a streamlined chain of command where decisions can be made efficiently and where dissent, if it occurs, can be managed and contained at higher levels before it ever becomes a public issue. Number 4. The romantic life compartmentalization doctrine, why love and loyalty can never occupy the same space. Here's where we enter one of the most controversial and heavily debated aspects of JYP's relationship rules for Stray Kids, and it's something that every single stay has probably wondered about at some point. What exactly is the company's stance on dating, romantic relationships, and the members' personal lives? The answer is far more sophisticated and psychologically intricate than a simple no dating rule, which is why it's called the romantic life compartmentalization doctrine. Essentially, JYP told the members that they're allowed to have romantic lives and personal relationships, but those romantic lives and personal relationships exist in a completely separate compartment from their identity as Stray Kids members. And under no circumstances are the two allowed to overlap or contaminate each other. This creates an absolutely fascinating psychological framework where members are simultaneously encouraged to be human and to have normal desires while being required to completely suppress and hide any evidence of those desires from the public sphere and, to a large extent, from their own group dynamic. The genius, or perhaps the tragedy of this rule, is that it acknowledges a fundamental reality. These are young men in their 20s and 30s who have hormones, emotions, and romantic desires just like any other humans. They're going to be attracted to people. They're going to want relationships. They're going to experience love, heartbreak, and everything in between. But from the company's perspective, allowing any of that to become public knowledge or to become integrated into the group's image would be catastrophic for their commercial viability. Particularly in markets like South Korea, where the idol industry still maintains a somewhat puritanical approach to members' romantic lives. So instead of saying you can never date, JYP essentially says you can date, but if you do, that relationship exists in a black box that never intersects with your public life or your role as a Stray Kids member. Think about the psychological weight of this rule for a moment. Imagine being a young man like Han or Felix, who's in his 20s, who's probably experiencing attraction and romantic feelings just like any normal person would, but knowing that if you pursue those feelings and they become public knowledge, you'll face massive backlash from fans, potential harm to the group's image, and the distinct possibility of your entire career trajectory being derailed. So what do? You compartmentalize. You create a version of yourself that exists in the public sphere, a version that's attractive, charismatic, emotionally available to fans, but completely asexual and romantically unavailable. And then in whatever private time you have, you might pursue a relationship, but you do it in secret. You hide it from the group, you hide it from the company, and you exist in constant fear that it might be discovered. This compartmentalization isn't just about keeping romantic relationships secret. It's about creating a psychological space where the members can literally forget that they're allowed to have romantic lives at all when they're in group mode. When they're performing, when they're in the practice room, when they're doing group content, when they're interacting as a unit, the romantic part of their humanity is supposed to be completely shut down and inaccessible. This is why you see Stray Kids members being so physically affectionate with each other in ways that might seem flirtatious to Western audiences, but are completely normalized in K-pop, because that physical affection is allowed because it exists within the group sphere. Whereas any physical or emotional affection directed towards someone outside the group would immediately violate the compartmentalization rule. What's particularly cruel about this doctrine is that it doesn't just affect individual members' romantic lives, it also impacts the group dynamic itself. Members can't really develop deep romantic or sexual identities separate from the group because they're not allowed to integrate those identities into their public presentation. So they exist in this strange liminal space where they're supposed to be mature, emotionally intelligent, and self-aware, but where a huge part of what makes them emotionally intelligent and self-aware, their capacity for romantic connection and sexual identity, is supposed to remain completely hidden and compartmentalized. This creates a situation where members might feel closer to their group brothers because those relationships are allowed to be fully integrated into their public identity, while their romantic relationships have to be secret, shame-filled, and separated from everything else in their lives. Think about how this would impact your own psychology if you were living this way. Your closest relationships, your most intimate connections, your most celebrated bonds are all with your 7 group members because those relationships are allowed to exist openly and fully. But your romantic relationships, which are arguably among the most important relationships in a person's life, have to be hidden and compartmentalized and treated as something shameful or dangerous. Over time, this could actually warp members' understanding of intimacy and connection, making them feel like their romantic lives are secondary to or less important than their group bonds, even if intellectually they know that's not healthy. The rule also creates a specific kind of loyalty framework where members' primary emotional and relational investment is expected to be in the group, not in romantic partners. If a member is dating someone, that person is always positioned as a threat to the group because they represent a romantic compartment that's trying to access the attention and emotional energy that's supposed to be devoted to stray kids. This is why so many K-pop dating scandals involve massive fan backlash, because the entire system is designed to create a competitive framework where fans and romantic partners are fighting for the same emotional real estate. And the company's rules have positioned the group as the legitimate claim and romantic relationships as the illegitimate one. What's particularly interesting is that this rule seems to have evolved slightly over the years as the members have aged and as social attitudes have shifted. In their early years, when members were younger and less established, the compartmentalization seemed to be almost absolute. There was almost no public acknowledgement that members had any romantic lives whatsoever. But as the group has matured and members have gotten older, there's been slightly more tolerance for members to hint at or acknowledge their romantic interests, though always in heavily coded and deniable ways. Members might make jokes about wanting to date, or might engage in fan service moments that play with romantic chemistry, but they're always doing so in a way that maintains the fundamental compartmentalization. They're not actually claiming to have romantic relationships. They're just acknowledging that the capacity for romance exists within them. This creates this bizarre semi-transparency where fans are allowed to speculate about members' romantic lives, and members are allowed to be aware that fans are speculating. But neither party is allowed to actually confirm or directly address those speculations. It's like everyone's participating in a collective game of, we all know this is real, but we're going to pretend we don't know, and the rule that makes this game possible is the romantic life compartmentalization doctrine. What's also worth noting is that this rule disproportionately affects younger members like Felix and I.N, who are still in their 20s and who are entering the years where romantic relationships and sexual identity become increasingly important parts of human development. For them, compartmentalization isn't just about keeping secrets, it's about actively suppressing a crucial part of their developmental process. They're being asked to put their romantic and sexual identity development on hold, to treat those parts of themselves as dangerous and shameful, and to prioritize their group identity above all else. This creates a particular kind of psychological tension for younger members that older members like Bang Chan and Lee No might handle differently because they're at a different life stage and have hopefully already completed some of their romantic and sexual identity development before entering the group. The doctrine also creates some fascinating dynamics in how members interact with each other, because there's an unspoken understanding that certain kinds of physical affection or emotional closeness between members is acceptable because it exists within the compartmentalization framework, whereas the same affection directed towards someone outside the group would be a violation. This means that members might actually feel safer being emotionally and physically intimate with each other than they do with romantic partners, because group intimacy is sanctioned and celebrated while romantic intimacy is hidden and shameful. Over time, this could create a situation where members are actually more bonded to each other than to any romantic partners they might have, not because they're secretly in love with each other, but simply because the company's rules have positioned their relationships with each other as the legitimate expression of intimacy and romance as the illegitimate one. Number 3. The mental health surveillance through care protocol, why checking in on each other feels like love but functions like control. This is where JYP's relationship rules for stray kids enter into genuinely unsettling territory, because they've essentially created a system that disguises monitoring and surveillance as brotherhood and care, in a way that's so psychologically sophisticated that even the members themselves might not fully recognize what's happening. The mental health surveillance through care protocol is based on a deceptively simple premise. The company instructed the members to be hyper-vigilant about each other's emotional and mental states, to constantly check in with one another, to monitor for signs of depression, anxiety, or emotional instability, and to report concerning behaviors to leadership. On the surface, this sounds beautiful. It sounds like the company is promoting member welfare and creating a culture of genuine care. But when you dig deeper, what you're actually looking at is a system where the members have been turned into informal mental health monitors for each other, where they're responsible not just for their own well-being, but for detecting and managing the emotional crises of everyone around them, and where the line between genuine care and coercive surveillance becomes impossibly blurred. Let's talk about what this looks like in practice, because this is crucial to understanding how Stray Kids actually functions as a group. When Han was struggling with his mental health during certain periods, it wasn't just that his members noticed and offered support, it's that they were literally trained and expected to notice, to intervene, and to ensure that the situation didn't spiral into something that might damage the group's stability or the company's interests. When Hyunjin was dealing with his scandal and the associated emotional fallout, the other members weren't just being good brothers by standing by him. They were also fulfilling a protocol that required them to monitor his mental state, to provide emotional stabilization, and to prevent him from becoming a liability to the group. This creates a bizarre dynamic where genuine care and institutional surveillance become completely indistinguishable from each other. Members can't tell if they're checking in on each other because they love each other or because they've been programmed to see monitoring each other as an expression of love. The protocol works by essentially weaponizing the members' natural instinct toward brotherhood and care and repurposing it as a management tool. JYP recognized that 8 young men living together, working together, and building a group identity together would naturally develop bonds of care and concern for each other. The company's genius move was to formalize and systematize those natural instincts, to turn them into an explicit protocol, and to make the members understand that their responsibility to monitor and support each other is not just an optional expression of love, but a mandatory part of their role within the group. This means that if one member is struggling and another member doesn't notice or doesn't intervene, there's not just a personal disappointment, there's an institutional failure. The monitoring member has failed in their protocol responsibilities, which means they've failed the group, which means they've failed the company's expectations, which means they've failed their brothers. This creates intense social pressure for members to be constantly vigilant, constantly aware, and constantly available as emotional support systems for each other, even when they themselves might be struggling and might need support. What's particularly insidious about this protocol is that it creates a system where members can't actually have private emotional experiences. If you're going through something difficult, you can't just process it privately or talk to a therapist or work through it on your own timeline, because you know that your brothers are monitoring your behavior for signs of distress. And you know that if they detect something concerning, they're obligated to intervene or report it. So you have to manage not just your own emotions, but also the perception of your emotions, not just dealing with the problem itself, but also managing how that problem appears to the people around you. This is a form of emotional labor that goes beyond what most people experience, because you're constantly performing wellness even when you're struggling. You're constantly reassuring your brothers that you're fine even when you're not. And you're constantly aware that your emotional state has implications for everyone around you and for the stability of the entire group. The protocol also creates fascinating power dynamics around who gets to be the caretaker and who gets to be the one being cared for. Generally, this breaks down along hierarchical lines, with older and more senior members taking on more caretaking responsibility and younger members being positioned as the ones who need more care and monitoring. But this isn't a fixed arrangement, it's fluid and contextual. When Han was struggling mentally, despite being relatively senior, he became the focus of intensive care and monitoring from all the other members. When I.N was going through a difficult period, the entire group shifted into a protective mode where his well-being became a priority. This means that every member, regardless of their position in the hierarchy, is simultaneously a monitor and monitored, a caretaker and cared for. You're always observing the people around you for signs of distress, while also being aware that you're being observed, which creates a kind of constant mutual surveillance that paradoxically makes the group incredibly cohesive, while also making genuine privacy almost impossible. What's also important to understand is that this protocol doesn't just operate at the emotional level. It has very real material consequences for members' lives and careers. If a member is identified as being in a concerning mental state, That information flows upward through the hierarchy to Bangchan and eventually to company leadership. The company can then make decisions about the members' schedule, their appearance in content, their public activities, or even their continued participation in the group based on that information. So when members are checking in on each other, they're not just offering emotional support, they're potentially gatekeeping information that could be used to make decisions about that person's career and livelihood. This creates a situation where members might be reluctant to be fully honest about their struggles with each other because they know that level of honesty could trigger interventions from company leadership that they might not want. So they end up performing recovery and wellness even within the group, which defeats the entire purpose of the protocol, but also demonstrates how psychologically sophisticated and ultimately self-defeating these kinds of surveillance systems become. The protocol also creates interesting gender dynamics, particularly around vulnerability and emotional expression. K-pop culture generally accepts and even celebrates emotional vulnerability from male idols in a way that Western pop culture traditionally hasn't. So Stray Kids members can be quite open about discussing their emotions, their struggles, and their mental health challenges. This openness is genuine and admirable, but it's also been strategically encouraged by the company as part of the mental health surveillance through CARE protocol. By making vulnerability acceptable and even celebrated, JYP ensures that members will continue to disclose information about their internal states, which keeps the surveillance system functioning smoothly. Members feel like they're in a progressive, emotionally intelligent environment where vulnerability is honored, and in many ways they are. But that same environment is also designed to extract and monitor information about their emotional states in ways that serve the company's interests. What's particularly fascinating is how this protocol has actually worked to create an incredibly tight-knit group. Members genuinely do seem to care deeply about each other, and they seem to have developed an almost intuitive sense of when someone in the group is struggling and needs support. This level of attunement to each other's emotional states is rare and beautiful, and it's something that definitely contributes to Stray Kids' reputation as one of the most cohesive groups in K-pop. But you have to wonder how much of that beautiful attunement is genuine emotional intelligence, and how much of it is the result of being systematically trained to monitor each other's behavior since they were teenagers. The protocol also raises interesting questions about consent and autonomy, because members never really consented to this level of emotional surveillance in any meaningful way. They were teenagers when they joined the company. They were trainees within a hierarchical system where they couldn't really refuse company directives, and they've now been living with this protocol for so long that it probably feels completely natural to them. They might not even recognize it as surveillance because it's been framed as care, and it has involved genuine care. But underneath the genuine care is a system designed to keep the company informed about members' emotional states and to ensure that those emotional states don't become a liability to the group or the company. Members have essentially given up the right to private emotional experiences in exchange for the assurance that if they're struggling, their brothers will notice and help. It's a trade-off that probably seems worth it to most of them most of the time, but it's a trade-off nonetheless, and it's one that they didn't really have much choice in making. Number 2. The sacrifice hierarchy system. Why some members are expected to give up more than others, and nobody talks about it. This is the rule that sits at the absolute core of Stray Kids' internal dynamics, and it's something that operates so silently and so systematically that even casual fans might not realize it exists. The sacrifice hierarchy system is JYP's way of codifying an unspoken reality. Not all members are expected to contribute equally to the group's success, and more importantly, not all members are expected to sacrifice equally for the group's well-being. Instead, there's a predetermined hierarchy of sacrifice where certain members are positioned as the pillars of the group, the ones who are expected to shoulder disproportionate amounts of emotional labor, creative responsibility, and personal compromise, while other members are positioned as the beneficiaries of those sacrifices, able to contribute at a more sustainable level because their sacrificial load has been distributed to others. This isn't something that was announced or formalized in any explicit way, but it's woven so deeply into how the group operates that it's practically invisible, which is exactly why it's so effective and so psychologically damaging. Let's start with the most obvious example: Bang Chan's sacrifice hierarchy is essentially infinite. As the leader, he's expected to sacrifice his personal time, his emotional well-being, his career opportunities, and his individual identity for the sake of the group at almost any moment. If the group needs him to work late into the night producing a track, he does it. If a member is struggling and needs emotional support, he provides it regardless of whether he himself is struggling. If the company needs him to make a decision that benefits the group but disadvantages him personally, he makes that decision without hesitation. His sacrifice isn't positioned as something noble that he's choosing, it's positioned as an inevitable consequence of his leadership position. In many ways, Bang Chan has accepted that his entire life is subordinate to Stray Kids' needs, and this acceptance has been so deeply internalized that you rarely see him expressing resentment or frustration about it. But the psychological cost of this level of sacrifice is incalculable, even if Bang Chan himself might not fully recognize it. Then you move down to members like Lee No and Changbin, who occupy what we might call the secondary sacrifice tier. These members are expected to make significant sacrifices, but not quite at Bang Chan's level. Lee No sacrifices his time and energy as the group's choreographer, constantly working to perfect the group's movements, to innovate their dancing, and to maintain their reputation as one of the most skilled dancing groups in K-pop. Changbin sacrifices his personal creative vision to some degree by positioning himself as a producer who supports the company and the group's direction rather than trying to push his own artistic agenda. They're both essential to the group's functioning, and they both carry significant responsibility, but their sacrifices are more bounded and more clearly defined than Bang Chan's infinite sacrifice. Then you have members like Hyunjin and Han, who occupy what we might call the selective sacrifice tier. These members are expected to make sacrifices in specific domains, Hyunjin in terms of managing his public image and his career after his scandal. Han in terms of openly discussing his mental health struggles in ways that demonstrate vulnerability and authenticity to fans. They're sacrificing their privacy and their agency in specific areas, but they're not expected to sacrifice across all domains of their lives the way Bang Chan or Lee No are. Then you have the younger members Felix, Sungmin, and I.N, who occupy what we might call the developmental sacrifice tier. These members are positioned as still developing, still learning, and still becoming who they're going to be within the group. Because of this positioning, they're not expected to make the same kinds of permanent, identity-altering sacrifices that older members are expected to make. Instead, their sacrifices are framed as temporary, as part of their developmental journey, as things they'll graduate out of as they mature and establish themselves within the group. This creates an expectation that at some point, presumably when they're older and more established, they'll transition into higher tiers of the sacrifice hierarchy. But for now, they're allowed to prioritize their development, their happiness, and their well-being in ways that older members aren't. The brilliance and tragedy of this system is that it's completely invisible because it's never articulated explicitly. No one says, Bang Chan, you're going to sacrifice more than everyone else. No one tells Lee No, your career development is going to be subordinate to the group's needs. No one tells Felix. Number 1. The legacy lock-in doctrine. Why stray kids can never truly leave and why they wouldn't want to. This is it. This is the final, most comprehensive, and most psychologically binding rule that JYP embedded into Stray Kids' foundational framework, and it's the one that essentially guarantees that no matter what happens, no matter what opportunities emerge, no matter what external pressures or temptations arise, these 8 members will remain bound to each other and to this group for the foreseeable future. The legacy lock-in doctrine is JYP's masterpiece of relationship engineering, and it works by making the members understand on a cellular level that their entire identity, their entire legacy, their entire value system, and their entire future is inextricably intertwined with Stray Kids in ways that can never be disentangled. This isn't about contractual obligations or legal bindings, those exist and matter, sure, but this is about something far more psychological and far more permanent. It's about making the members believe that their individual success is impossible without the group, that their personal happiness is dependent on the group's stability, and that leaving the group or prioritizing anything above the group would be a form of existential betrayal that would haunt them forever. Let's start with the obvious. These 8 members have grown up together. Most of them have spent their formative years, their late teens and 20s, which are absolutely crucial developmental periods, not just working together, but living together, practicing together, suffering together, and succeeding together. They've built a shared vocabulary, a shared history, shared traumas, and shared triumphs that no other people on Earth can possibly understand or replicate. This shared experience creates bonds that are genuinely powerful and genuine, but JYP didn't just let these bonds develop naturally, they systematically cultivated and weaponized them. The company made sure that every significant moment in these members' lives happened within the context of the group. Your first comeback? It happened with your brothers. Your first award? You accepted it as part of Stray Kids. Your first international performance? You did it representing the group. Your first heartbreak, your first loss, your first major professional success, all of these defining life moments happened within the framework of the group, which means that these moments are fundamentally inseparable from your identity as a member of Stray Kids. This is the foundation of the legacy lock and doctrine. By ensuring that the most important moments in members' lives are group moments, JYP has essentially made it impossible for members to develop a sense of individual identity that's separate from their group identity. Who is Bangchan without Stray Kids? He's been the leader of this group since he was a teenager. He's invested years of his life building this group's foundation. He's sacrificed countless personal opportunities to prioritize the group's success. At this point, walking away from the group would feel like walking away from a fundamental part of himself. Who is Han without Stray Kids? He's poured his creative energy into this group's music. He's built relationships with these specific members that have sustained him through mental health crises. He's developed as an artist specifically within the context of this group's sound and vision. Leaving would feel like betraying not just his brothers, but also himself. This psychological fusion of personal identity with group identity is the genius of the legacy lock and doctrine, because it means that the members don't need to be threatened or coerced to stay committed. They're staying because leaving would mean abandoning a fundamental part of who they are. But the doctrine goes even deeper than that. JYP has also systematically constructed Stray Kids' legacy and success in ways that make it clear to the members that the group's achievements are their achievements, and that any future success they might have outside the group will always be measured against what they accomplished within the group. If Bangchan ever goes solo, he'll be the former Stray Kids leader. If Han ever does a solo project, it'll be the Stray Kids members' solo debut. Their individual achievements will always be contextually framed through the lens of their group membership, which means that there's no such thing as truly transcending or moving beyond the group. After diving deep into all 7 of JYP's relationship rules for Stray Kids, what becomes crystal clear is that these aren't isolated protocols. They're a sophisticated, interlocking system designed to create the most cohesive, controllable, and commercially viable group possible. Each rule reinforces the others. Each rule creates specific vulnerabilities that other rules exploit. And together they form a psychological architecture that essentially guarantees Stray Kids' functionality as a group while simultaneously constraining members' individual autonomy, personal development, and psychological freedom in ways that most people outside the system would find shocking and concerning. The leader first, friend second mandate ensures that Bangchan will never be fully available to his brothers as an equal, creating a necessary hierarchical distance that prevents the group from becoming too equal or democratic. The transparency over secrets protocol removes the possibility of members developing truly private mental spaces, ensuring that the company always has access to information about members' internal states. The hierarchy within equality framework prevents internal power struggles by predefining everyone's position within the group, but it also constrains how much influence younger members can exercise. The individual authenticity versus group image balance allows members to appear genuine while actually being carefully curated, creating plausible deniability for the company's control. The romantic life compartmentalization doctrine ensures that members' primary emotional investment remains in the group rather than in external relationships. The mental health surveillance through care protocol transforms members into informal monitors of each other, while disguising surveillance as brotherhood. The sacrifice hierarchy system ensures that burden is distributed unequally, with certain members carrying disproportionate loads. And finally, the legacy lock and doctrine ties all of this together by making members feel so bound to the group that they can't imagine functioning without it. What's most remarkable about this system is that it actually works. Stray Kids genuinely is one of the most cohesive, genuinely connected groups in K-pop. Their brotherhood appears authentic because, to a large extent, it is authentic. These members do love each other, they do support each other, they do have genuine bonds. But those genuine bonds exist within and are shaped by a system that was designed to create and maintain them, which means that we can never fully separate the authentic from the manufactured, the genuine from the strategic. The members themselves probably can't separate these things anymore because they've been living within this system for so long that the lines have become invisible. For stays, understanding these rules might actually increase your appreciation for what Stray Kids has accomplished, because it makes clear how genuinely difficult and psychologically complex it is to maintain the kind of unity and cohesion that they display. It's not just that they're talented or lucky or compatible, it's that they're living within a system that was explicitly designed to make them compatible, to make them dependent on each other, and to make them unable to imagine functioning apart. The fact that they've managed to not only survive, but to thrive within the system, to create genuine art and genuine connections despite the constraints, is actually more impressive than if they had simply gotten along naturally. But it's also important to recognize that this system comes with real costs, costs that the members themselves might not fully acknowledge or even recognize. The lack of private mental space, the constant surveillance disguised as care, the unequal distribution of burden, the compartmentalization of romantic life, the impossibility of developing a sense of self outside the group. These are real constraints on human freedom and human development, and they deserve to be recognized and named, even if we also recognize that the system has produced something genuinely beautiful and valuable in Stray Kids' music, performances, and brotherhood. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. Stray Kids is both a genuine brotherhood and a carefully engineered system, both authentically connected and strategically constructed, both a beautiful achievement and a psychological pressure cooker. Recognizing both of these truths simultaneously is the only way to truly understand what JYP has built with Stray Kids and what these 8 members have sacrificed and achieved in the process. Thank you for watching. This channel is now closed.